646 meters above the flat farmland west of Warsaw, a maintenance worker clips his harness to a steel cable and begins loosening a bolt. It is the afternoon of August 8, 1991. Below him, the Konstantinov radio mast stretches down through the clouds, the tallest structure ever built by human hands, taller than the Eiffel Tower, stacked almost twice over. None of the men working on it that day know that the order in which they are about to disconnect two cables will decide whether this tower stands or falls. In under 10 seconds, 646 meters of steel will fold in on itself and crash to the earth. This is the story of how a single misordered step, a mistake that cost almost nothing to avoid, destroyed the tallest man-made structure on the planet. Rewind 3 days. To understand why this tower existed at all, you have to understand what Poland was trying to prove. In the late 1960s, Communist Poland needed a radio transmitter powerful enough to reach every corner of the country, and beyond it, every Polish community scattered across the world, from Western Europe to the frozen research stations of Antarctica. The existing transmitter at Racine, near Warsaw, simply wasn't tall enough or strong enough to do the job. So, Polish engineers, led by designer Jan Polak, set out to build something almost absurd in scale, a guide steel lattice mast reaching 646. 38 meters into the sky, held vertical not by its own strength, but by 3 arrays of steel cables anchored to the ground at 5 different heights. The highest anchor point nearly 600 meters up. Construction began in 1970 near the village of Gomin, chosen for its soil conductivity, and by May 1974 the mast was complete. Its transmitter went live that July, broadcasting Polski Radio's Program 1 at 2 megawatts of power on the long-wave band. The signal was so strong it could be picked up not just across Europe, but in parts of North Africa, and, on a good night, across the Atlantic in Canada and the United States. An elevator ran up the center of the structure. The trip from the ground to the top took 30 minutes. For 17 years, the Konstantinov mast held the Guinness World Record for the tallest structure ever built by humans, a title it would not lose until the Burj Khalifa opened in 2009. But a tower this tall carries a burden most buildings never face. Its own guy wires, the very cables holding it upright, are also carrying a lethal electrical charge, because the mast itself functions as the antenna, humming with roughly 120 zollnerivolts relative to the ground, which meant every single cable holding this giant vertical needed its own insulating brakes, engineered caps of ceramic and steel that had to be inspected, maintained, and eventually replaced. And by the mid-1980s, engineers already knew something about those cables that should have worried them a great deal more than it did. 10 years after the mast went into service, routine inspections found something troubling. The constant sway of a structure this tall, flexing in the wind day after day, year after year, had begun to damage the backstay insulators and the guy wires themselves. Engineers proposed the obvious fix: replace the aging guying system with a stronger one. But at this point, the disaster was still decades away, and easily avoidable. The problem was money. By the mid-1980s, Poland's economy was in freefall, store shelves were empty. Inflation was climbing toward hyperinflation, and the state broadcasting authority, like every other institution in the country, simply did not have the funds for a full-scale replacement of the mast's support system. So the repair was postponed. In 1988, workers began repainting the tower's corroding steel structure, a basic maintenance task meant to slow the rust. They couldn't finish. There wasn't enough paint in the country to complete the job. Therefore, the tower kept aging while the people responsible for it kept waiting for a budget that never came. In May 1989, an inspection team climbed the mast and found 13 individual strands fractured across the upper guy wires. By the time engineers checked again in 1991, 7 of the guy wire insulators had visibly deteriorated. The tower was still standing, still broadcasting, still the tallest structure on Earth. But the men maintaining it were now managing a slow-motion structural failure with a maintenance budget built for a healthy tower. So, on August 8, 1991, a crew from Mostostal Zabrze, the company responsible for building and maintaining the mast, climbed up to begin the job everyone had been putting off, replacing one of the frayed main guy wires at the highest anchor point, nearly 600 meters above the ground. And here's where the story stops being about neglect and becomes about a single procedural decision made that afternoon. To replace a main guy wire on a structure like this, you cannot simply unscrew it and pull it away. The mast would instantly lose lateral support at that level. Instead, the standard procedure calls for 2 temporary cables to be rigged and tensioned first, so that the load is transferred smoothly from the old cable to the new supports before the original is ever disconnected. It is a sequence. Old cable stays under tension. New cables go up. New cables take the strain. Only then does the old cable come off. But that afternoon the sequence broke. The main cable was disconnected before the 2 temporary replacements had been properly secured. For a brief window, at the single highest point of stress on the entire tower, the mast was left standing on its own, unsupported at the level that mattered most. It was still at that exact moment avoidable. A calm afternoon, a few careful minutes, and no one on the ground would ever have known how close disaster had come. But there was wind that day, not a storm, not anything the mast in healthy condition couldn't have shrugged off without a second thought. Just enough of a gust at exactly the wrong second to catch 646 meters of temporarily unmoored steel and begin to twist it. Remember this, the entire mast, all 646 meters of it, was designed to depend on continuous tension from cables at 5 separate levels. Break that tension at even one level, at the wrong moment, and the whole chain of support above and below it is compromised. The gust hits. The tower, unsupported at its highest guy point, begins to twist. The twisting motion doesn't stay contained. It travels down the structure, cable by cable, pulling loose the tension in the guy wires below it, one after another, faster than any human reaction time could compensate for. The mast bends. 600 meters of steel lattice, built to stand perfectly straight for 17 years, folds sideways like a blade of grass caught in a gust. Then it snaps, roughly halfway up its height, the upper section breaking away entirely from the lower structure that still stands, rooted in its concrete base. From the moment the wind caught the unsupported cable to the moment the tower lay broken across the Polish farmland, less than 10 seconds passed. Steel debris, some pieces the size of small cars, rained down for hundreds of meters in every direction. Witnesses later described chunks of the tower's lattice structure driving into the earth like javelins, some burying themselves in the soil on impact. And here is the detail that almost defies belief. Despite a structure taller than most skyscrapers folding and crashing to the ground in under 10 seconds, with a maintenance crew working on it at the time, no one was killed. No one was seriously injured. The workers who had been up on that mast and the ground crew below walked away from a collapse that destroyed the tallest man-made structure on the planet. The transmitter building and the helix building at the base of the mast, structures that had stood directly beneath the falling steel, remained intact. Polish State Radio's Program 1 went silent that afternoon. Its signal switched over to the older, far weaker Rosin transmitter within hours. But the human cost against every statistical expectation for a disaster of this scale was 0 lives lost, which raises the question investigators now had to answer. If the wind alone wasn't strong enough to bring down a healthy mast, and the mast had survived worse weather countless times before, what actually made this the day it failed? An investigating committee moved in almost immediately. The scale of the wreckage made one thing obvious from the start. This wasn't a design failure. The mast's engineering, the same design that had held the record for the world's tallest structure for 17 years, was sound. Jan Polak's original calculations weren't wrong, so investigators turned their attention to the maintenance records and to the exact sequence of actions taken on the mast that afternoon. At first, the obvious suspect was the wind. A gust, a moment of bad luck, an act of nature nobody could have prevented. But engineers quickly ruled that out. The wind that day, while present, was well within the range the tower had weathered dozens of times over 17 years of service. A healthy mast, with all of its guy wires under proper tension, does not fold in half because of an ordinary summer gust. So the real question wasn't what force broke the tower. It was why the tower had no defense against a force it should have easily survived. And that answer was sitting in the maintenance procedure itself. Here is the detail that changes the entire story. The tower's own guying system, the very feature that let it reach an unprecedented height in the first place, was also its single point of failure because the mast depended on continuous tension from guy wires at 5 separate levels to remain vertical. Removing tension from even one wire, even briefly, left the entire structure vulnerable at exactly that height. And on August 8th, that is exactly what happened. The crew replacing the main guy wire at the highest anchoring level disconnected the old cable before the temporary replacement cables had taken up the load. For a matter of minutes, maybe less, the mast's most critical support point was carrying no lateral tension at all. It wasn't a faulty part. It wasn't a hidden design flaw waiting 17 years to reveal itself. It was a sequencing error, an order of operations, reversed at the one moment in the mast's entire operational history when it could not afford to be reversed. Something that cost nothing to do correctly, and everything when done in the wrong order. The investigation placed responsibility squarely on Mostostal Zabrze, the firm that had built and maintained the mast for its entire operational life. The construction coordinator overseeing the work and the division chief responsible for the maintenance procedures were both found liable for the collapse. Both men were sentenced to prison. But the deeper finding, the one that mattered far beyond Poland's borders, was this. A structure that had stood as an engineering marvel for nearly 2 decades had been brought down not by weather, not by material failure, but by 2 cables disconnected in the wrong order on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. In the aftermath, the Polish government considered rebuilding the mast on the same site. By 1995, funding had even been allocated, but local residents, worried about long-term exposure to the mast's powerful electromagnetic transmissions, protested the plans until they were abandoned entirely. Instead, Poland built a new, far more modest transmission center at Sołek Kujawski, using 2 shorter masts, the tallest just over 300 meters, roughly half the height of what had stood at Konstantino. The wreckage itself was largely left where it fell. For 30 years, twisted steel and broken lattice sections lay scattered across the Polish countryside near Gumbin, a monument nobody had planned to build, until the remaining structures were finally cleared away in 2021. But the more lasting legacy of August 8, 1991, isn't the empty field where the world's tallest structure used to stand. It's the procedure. Today, anyone maintaining a guide mast anywhere in the world works under a hard rule written in the shadow of Constantino. A load-bearing support is never disconnected until its replacement is already carrying the load, not almost secured, not about to be secured, already bearing the strain before the old cable comes free. It sounds like common sense. It is common sense now, precisely because it wasn't followed once, on a tower tall enough to be seen from space on a clear day. Imagine standing at the base of that mast in the years before its collapse, craning your neck upward until the top simply vanished into the clouds, 646 meters above you, engineered down to the centimeter, A genuine marvel of Cold War-era ambition. And imagine that, all of it, every ton of steel, every kilometer of cable, depended in its final moments on the order in which two men disconnected two wires. That is the quiet, uncomfortable lesson at the heart of this story. The tallest structure human beings had ever built didn't fall because the engineering failed. It fell because, for a handful of minutes on an ordinary afternoon, someone did the right procedure in the wrong order. Every collapse in this series carries the same warning. It's rarely the grand design that fails first. It's the small steps someone decided didn't matter. Subscribe for the next story of a disaster that started exactly that small.